In my recent video on the Muchmore film, I expressed skepticism about Marie Muchmore having photographed the assassination scene as we see it here in the Muchmore film today. And mainly the reason I was skeptical of that is because she told the FBI that she had not photographed any of the assassination. And yet, here it is in the film. Now, I'm going to explore the idea that she didn't actually take this film here of the assassination in this video. And one reason to think she didn't is that she would have had to have changed her position significantly to take the film on Elm Street of the assassination. And here, according to her own film, she seems to stay in her position on Houston Street quite a long time, as if she isn't planning to go anywhere else to take more footage. This doesn't prove it, but the implication, I think, is that she wasn't going anywhere, that she filmed well after the president had passed her position, and therefore it seems unlikely to me that she was planning to run anywhere else to take more film. Now here I've put a frame of the Muchmore film over a frame or one of the Bond photos where the car is in approximately the same position in order to attempt to determine the relative positions of the camera. And I deem the Bond camera to be higher than the Muchmore camera based upon the several things in the photo, but the one I'm focusing on here because it's the easiest one to see is the motorcycle helmet there relative to the position of the building in the background. Quite clearly, the motorcycle helmet is in a higher position relative to the background, the building in the background in the Muchmore film, than it is in the Bond photo. What this means is that the Muchmore camera is lower than the Bond camera. I'm not going to get into trying to explain why, but the perspective means that Muchmore is lower, presumably shorter, than Bond. And as for the left to right positions, I was unable to determine that because the Muchmore film is not of good enough quality, but it looks like, therefore, because I couldn't determine for sure which one was left or right, that they're in virtually the same position, left and right. Not exactly the same position, but virtually the same. So Bond, to put it in terms of their bodies, Bond is taller than Muchmore, and they're just about in the same left to right position. And we've got this head that you can see in the Bond photo that's in front of the photographer Bond, the head of a shorter person, or a person at least who was lower in position, and there's no such person in the Muchmore film. So if they're virtually standing together, and Muchmore is shorter than Bond, and nobody's head is in the Muchmore film, then what that means is almost certainly the head we see in the Bond film is the head of Mary Muchmore. So I do declare that this is Mary Muchmore's head, that Mary Muchmore or Marie Muchmore is standing in front of Wilma Bond, slightly to Wilma Bond's right, and that she is lower, shorter, at least her head is lower than Wilma Bond's head. So now I want to find Marie Muchmore in some other photography, either from the other side of the street or from some position where I can see where she's standing on Houston Street. Now this graphic is from Wilma Bond's Find a Grave page, where somebody, I think, has correctly identified the head of Marie Muchmore in the Bond photo in the lower right, but I think this person has incorrectly identified Wilma Bond in the Skaggs photo. The main problem with this identification, that is Wilma Bond, is that she would have her camera in front of her face at this moment, and this person has no camera in front of her face. So I don't think that could possibly be Bond. I think there's another person in front of her there that you might argue is Marie Muchmore, but I think she's off a little to the wrong side, for one thing. And neither one of them has a camera in front of their face, and we know Muchmore is filming at this very moment because she's filming the movie, and Bond either just took a picture and is about to take another one. I don't think her camera could ever have left her face, and neither one of these people has a camera in front of her face. So I don't think either one of those could be Wilma Bond or Marie Muchmore. So I declare the person on Find a Grave to be incorrect in this identification. And the only other still photo that might be helpful is the Weaver photo, but the quality of the Weaver photo, at least in the form that it still exists, is not good enough to determine, to identify anybody there on the west side of Houston Street. But looky here at this frame from the Hughes film. We have a woman standing in the right place. She's either shorter, or maybe it's just because she's standing on the street, it makes her shorter than the people behind her. She looks like she's holding a camera in front of her, just above waist level, as if she has finished taking photographs. And this would be just shortly after the Muchmore film sequence on Houston Street ends. The last thing you can see in that is that Secret Service car with the partially open door. And it looks like this is just a little bit after that. So I think, and this is a little bit out of frame in the Skaggs photo I was looking at. You can tell, but you can see there's another person with a red skirt on there who's in frame in the Skaggs, but where this other person is, that I think is Marie Muchmore, would have been out of frame. So I think that's Marie Muchmore. And look at her. She's standing there like she's not planning to go anywhere, while the presidential limo is already turning onto Elm Street. And here, running the part of the Hughes film where Marie Muchmore is visible, she's not visible in much of it, it looks like she's not planning to go anywhere. It looks like she might be getting a little excited. Maybe the first shot was fired or something, I don't know. But it doesn't look like she's planning to go anywhere. And she told the FBI that she didn't take film of the assassination. So I think that this sequence of the assassination was taken by somebody else, that Marie Muchmore didn't actually take it. As far as I can tell, not much is known about Marie Muchmore and Wilma Bond's trip to Dealey Plaza. The most information seems to be in the earlier FBI report here, where it says they're employed by Justin McCarty dress manufacturers, and that 5 other employees came with Marie Muchmore. That would mean there are 4 other employees, which I believe we do not know the names of. Maybe their names are in the evidence and they're not identified as such, or maybe I just don't know the information. But it seems there's some mystery here that I find possibly significant, because they're dress manufacturers. The company are dress manufacturers. Zapruder is a dress manufacturer. I'm convinced that Zapruder, although I don't think he knew the president was going to be murdered, was participating in a what you could call a conspiracy, even as far as he knew. I think my theory is that some people were told that this was a sting operation, and they did not expect that the president was going to be shot. I think that's probably partially why Zapruder agreed to participate. And afterwards, they were probably told that Oswald went wild or went rogue and shot the president anyway, or something like that. So it wouldn't surprise me if one of these other employees we don't have the names of might have been a friend or an associate of Zapruder, and maybe that's why we don't have his name, and maybe that's why the assassination sequence from the Muchmore film was attributed to Muchmore, because if they attributed it to the actual person who took the film, then that might show a connection to Zapruder that might look a bit suspicious. Now, you might argue that if my speculation was right about this, that it would have been better for them to just leave this other film taken by this other person as unknown. Why tack on a bit of it to the Muchmore film? And I think the reason would be to prove that Charles Brem and his son and the Babushka lady were really in that position at the time of the assassination. Yes, we can see them there in the Zapruder film, but as I have explained in other videos, I don't think they really are there. I think they're on the other side of Hill and Moorman, where we see them later in the Bond film. I think during the assassination they were actually on the other side, and that the photography was altered to make it seem as though they were on the side we see them on in the Muchmore film. And actually, I think that Joey and the Babushka lady both were standing in this position. We see them here during the assassination, and that Charles Brem had not yet joined them. And that was all done to provide an alibi for Billy Lovelady, involving photo trickery, which James Alkins and Charles Brem participated in. So I think the reason for tacking this onto the Muchmore film would be to help corroborate that Brem and the Babushka lady were on the same side of Hill and Moorman as they appear to be in the Zapruder film. And this would also have been changed in the Bronson film, and I think the Bronson film is another altered film. In the Bronson film, it would be much easier to do the alterations because all the figures and objects would be much smaller in that film, and it would be much harder to detect alteration. And Brem and the Babushka lady do not appear in the next film. So the Muchmore film footage of the assassination is the only relatively up-close film we have that corroborates the position of Brem and the Babushka lady that appears in the Zapruder film. And I think they might have thought it was important to corroborate that because they knew they weren't really there, and if there was some testimony to that effect that they weren't really there, they would be able to decisively prove that testimony wrong, because they have the Zapruder film shows them on that side, and now the Muchmore film shows them on that side. So I think that would be the reason why that this alteration by addition was made to the Muchmore film. And the alteration I pointed out in this Muchmore film frame here, that I pointed out in my Muchmore film video, probably means that in the original footage taken by this unknown person that was with Marie Muchmore, probably means that there was a motorcycle in front of the limousine there that had to be removed to make it consistent with the Zapruder film. And I think, I can't know for sure, but I think probably the Newmans were really there with the limousine, and that the Babushka lady Brem and his son were added here. And also the fact that we have very short clips in the Muchmore film and in the Bronson film means that even though it's hard work doing this sort of alteration with moving objects, there's not much of it to do. There's only a few frames that need the work. So it's not an impossible task. So my conclusion here is that Muchmore did not take the assassination sequence that we see in the Muchmore film.